Okay, let's finish chapter 1, The Sound of the Shell. So we'll pick up where Ralph has just called all the children using the sound of the shell. And they just elected Ralph chief over Jack Meridew, the leader of the choir. And I'm going to pick up right here. Listen, everybody. This is Ralph talking. I've got to have time to think things out. I can't decide what to do straight off. If this isn't an island, we might be rescued straight away. So we've got to decide if this is an island. Everybody must stay around here and wait and not go away. 3 of us, if we take more, we'd get all mixed and lose each other. 3 of us will go on an expedition and find out. I'll go, and Jack, and he looked around the circle of eager faces. There was no lack of boys to choose from. And Simon. The boys around Simon giggled, and he stood up laughing a little. Now that the pallor of his faint was over, he was a skinny, vivid little boy, with a glance coming up from under a hut of straight hair that hung down black and coarse. He nodded at Ralph. "I'll come." "And I." Jack snatched from behind him a sizable sheath knife and clouded it into a trunk. The buzz rose and died away. Piggy stirred. "I'll come." Ralph turned to him. "You're no good on a job like this." "All the same, we don't want you," said Jack flatly. "3's enough." Piggy's glasses flashed. "Well, I was with him when he found the conch. I was with him before anyone else was." Jack and the others paid no attention. There was a general dispersal. Ralph, Jack, and Simon jumped off the platform and walked along the sand past the bathing pool. Piggy hung bumbling behind them. "Well, if Simon walks in the middle of us," said Ralph, "then we could talk over his head." The 3 of them fell into step. This meant that every now and then Simon had to do a double shuffle to catch up with the others. Presently Ralph stopped and turned back to Piggy. "Look." Jack and Simon pretended to notice nothing. They walked on. "You can't come." Piggy's glasses were misted again, this time with humiliation. "You told him, after what I said." His face flushed, his mouth trembled. "After I said I didn't want..." "What on earth are you talking about?" "About being called Piggy. I said I didn't care as long as they didn't call me Piggy, and I said not to tell them. And then you went and said straight out." Stillness descended on them. Ralph, looking with more understanding at Piggy, saw that he was hurt and crushed. He hovered between the 2 courses of apology or further insult. "Better Piggy than Fatty," he said at last, with the directness of genuine leadership. "And anyway, I'm sorry you feel like that. Now go back, Piggy, and take names. That's your job. So long." He turned and raced after the other 2. Hey, I just want to point out here for a second, right? Like, most of us reading this would go, if we were in that situation, not only would we say sorry, and he almost, right? Anyway, I'm sorry you feel like that. It's not a real apology. But you would ask what his real name is. But he doesn't. Right? He's still calling him Piggy. Well, Piggy stood, and the rose of indignation faded slowly from his cheeks. He went back to the platform. The 3 boys walked briskly on the sand. The tide was low, and there was a strip of weed-strewn beach that was almost as firm as a road. A kind of glamour was spread over them in the scene, and they were conscious of the glamour, and made happy by it. They turned to each other, laughing excitedly, talking, not listening. The air was bright, and Ralph, faced by the task of translating all this into an explanation, stood on his head and fell over. When they had done laughing, Simon stroked Ralph's arm shyly, and they had to laugh again. "Come on," said Jack presently. "We're explorers." "We'll go to the end of the island," said Ralph, "and look round the corner." "If it is an island." Now, toward the end of the afternoon, the mirages were settling a little. They found the end of the island, quite distinct, and not magicked out of shape or sense. There was a jumble of the usual squareness, with one great block sitting out in a lagoon. Seabirds were nesting there. "Like icing," said Ralph, "on a pink cake." "Well, we shan't see round this corner," said Jack, "because there isn't one. Only a slow curve. And you can see the rocks get worse." Ralph shaded his eyes and followed the jagged outline of the crags up toward the mountain. This part of the beach was nearer the mountain than any other that they had seen. "We'll try climbing the mountain from here," he said. "I should think this is the easiest way. There's less of that jungly stuff and more pink rock. Come on." The three boys began to scramble up. Some unknown force had wrenched and shattered these cubes so that they lay askew, often piled diminishingly on each other. The most usual feature of the rock was a pink cliff surmounted by a skewed block, and that again surmounted, and that again, till the pinkness became a stack of balanced rock projecting through the looped fantasy of the forest creepers. Where the pink cliffs rose out of the ground, there were often narrow tracks winding upwards. They could edge along them deep in the plant world, their faces to the rock. What made this track? Jack paused, wiping the sweat from his face. Ralph stood by him, breathless. Men? Jack shook his head. Animals. Ralph peered into the darkness under the trees. The forest minutely vibrated. "Come on." The difficulty was not the steep ascent round the shoulders of rock, but the occasional plunges through the undergrowth to get to the next path. Here the roots and stems of creepers were in such tangles that the boys had to thread through them like pliant needles. Their only guide, apart from the brown ground and occasional flashes of light through the foliage, was the tendency of slope. Whether this hole, laced as it was with the cables of creeper, stood higher than that. Somehow, they moved up. Immured in these tangles, at perhaps their most difficult moment, Ralph turned with shining eyes to the others. "Wacko! Wizard! Smashing!" By the way, that's like 1950s slang for like awesome, cool, wow. The cause of their pleasure was not obvious. All three were hot, dirty, and exhausted. Ralph was badly scratched. The creepers were as thick as their thighs and left little but tunnels for further penetration. Ralph shouted experimentally, and they listened to the muted echoes. "This is real exploring," said Jack. "I bet nobody's been here before." "We ought to draw a map," said Ralph, "only we haven't any paper." "Well, we could make scratches on bark," said Simon, "and rub black stuff in." Again came the solemn communion of shining eyes in the gloom. "Wacko! Wizard!" There was no place for standing on one's head. This time, Ralph expressed the intensity of his emotion by pretending to knock Simon down, and soon they were a happy, heaving pile in the underdusk. Right, because that's exactly what boys would do, right? They're going to shove each other when they get all excited. I mean, I see this all the time. Like, if class ends a little bit early and kids are like excited to get out of the door, you've seen it, right? And you start shoving each other. If these were girls, I don't know, they'd be like measuring the angle of the sun or something to see how much time they have left. But not boys, they're just physical. When they had fallen apart, Ralph spoke first. "Got to get on." The pink granite of the next cliff was further back from the creepers and trees so that they could trot up the path. This again led into more open forest so that they had a glimpse of the spread sea. With openness came the sun. It dried the sweat that had soaked their clothes in the dark, damp heat. At last, the way to the top looked like a scramble over pink rock with no more plunging through darkness. The boys chose their way through defiles and over heaps of sharp stone. "Look! Look!" High over this end of the island, the shattered rocks lifted up their stacks and chimneys. This one, against which Jack leaned, moved with a grating sound when they pushed. "Come on!" but not come on to the top. Well, the assault on the summit must wait while the three boys accepted this challenge. The rock was as large as a small motor car. Heave! Sway back and forth, catch the rhythm. Heave! Increase the swing of the pendulum. Increase. Come up and bear against that point of furthest balance. Increase. Heave! The great rock loitered, poised on one toe, decided not to return, moved through the air, fell, struck, turned over, leapt, droning through the air, and smashed a deep hole in the canopy of the forest. Echoes and birds flew. White and pink dust floated. The forest further down shook as with the passage of an enraged monster. And then the island was still. Wacko! Like a bomb. Woohoo! Not for 5 minutes could they drag themselves away from this triumph, but they left at last. Yeah, and just notice here for a second that these boys pushed this rock, because why not, right? Because it's just fun to break stuff with no point sometimes. So they get up there and they find this giant rock and they just push, and just the thrill of it, this giant rock the size of a car tumbling down the mountain, making a giant hole in the forest below. It's that sense of power, right? Like, look at us over nature. Yeah, boys. But they left at last. The way to the top was easy after that. As they reached the last stretch, Ralph stopped. Golly! They were on the lip of a circular hollow in the side of the mountain. This was filled with a blue flower, a rock plant of some sort, and the overflow hung down the vent and spilled lavishly among the canopy of the forest. The air was thick with butterflies, lifting, fluttering, settling. Beyond the hollow was the square top of the mountain, and soon they were standing on it. They had guessed before that this was an island, clambering among the pink rocks with the sea on either side and the crystal heights of air. They had known by some instinct that the sea lay on every side. But there seemed something more fitting in leaving that last word till they stood on the top and could see a circular horizon of water. Ralph turned to the others. This belongs to us. The island was roughly boat-shaped, humped near this end with behind them the jumbled descent to the shore. On either side, rocks, cliffs, treetops, and a steep slope. Forward there, the length of the boat, a tamer descent, tree-clad with hints of pink. And then the jungly flat of the island, dense and green, but drawn at the end to a pink tail. There, where the island petered out in water, was another island, a rock almost detached, standing like a fort, facing them across the green with one bold pink bastion. The boys surveyed all this, then looked out to sea. They were high up and the afternoon had advanced. The view was not robbed of sharpness by mirage. That's a reef, a coral reef. I've seen pictures like that. The reef enclosed more than one side of the island, lying perhaps a mile out and parallel to what they now thought of as their beach. The coral was scribbled in the sea, as though a giant had bent down to reproduce the shape of the island in a flowing chalk line, but tired before he had finished. Inside was peacock water, rocks and weeds showing as in an aquarium. Outside was the dark blue of the sea. The tide was running so that long streaks of foam tailed away from the reef, and for a moment they felt that the boat was moving steadily astern. Jack pointed down. Well, that's where we landed. Beyond falls and cliffs, there was a gash visible in the trees. There were the splintered trunks and then the drag, leaving only a fringe of palm between the scar and the sea. There, too, jutting into the lagoon, was the platform, with insect-like figures moving near it. Ralph sketched a twining line from the bald spot on which they stood, down a slope, a gully, through flowers, round and down to the rock where the scar started. That's the quickest way back. eyes shining, mouths open, triumphant. They savored the right of domination. They were lifted up. They were friends. Well, there's no village smoke and no boats, said Ralph wisely. We'll make sure later, but I think it's uninhabited. We'll get food, cried Jack. Hunt, catch things until they fetch us. Simon looked at them both, saying nothing but nodding till his black hair flopped forwards and backwards. His face was glowing. Ralph looked down the other way, where there was no reef. Steeper, said Jack. Ralph made a cupping gesture. That bit of forest down there. The mountain holds it up. Every point of the mountain held up trees, flowers, and trees, and now the forest stirred, roared, flailed. The near acres of rocks, flowers, fluttered, and for a half a minute the breeze blew cool on their faces. Ralph spread his arms. All ours. They laughed and tumbled and shouted on the mountain. I'm hungry. Now when Simon mentioned his hunger, the others became aware of theirs. Come on, said Ralph. We found out what we wanted to know. They scrambled down a rock slope, dropped among flowers, and made their way under the trees. Here they paused and examined the bushes round them curiously. Simon spoke first. Like candles, candle bushes, candle buds. The bushes were dark evergreen and aromatic, and the many buds were waxen green and folded up against the light. Jack slashed at one with his knife, and the scent spilled over them. Candle buds. Well, you couldn't light them, said Ralph. They just looked like candles. Green candles, said Jack contemptuously. We can't eat them. Come on. They were in the beginnings of the thick forest, plonking with weary feet on a track, when they heard the noises, squeakings, and the hard strike of hooves on a path. As they pushed forward, the squeaking increased till it became a frenzy. They found a piglet caught in a curtain of creepers, throwing itself at the elastic traces in all the madness of extreme terror. Its voice was thin, needle-sharp, and insistent. The three boys rushed forward, and Jack drew his knife again with a flourish. He raised his arm in the air. There came a pause, a hiatus. The pig continued to scream, and the creepers to jerk, and the blade continued to flash at the end of a bony arm. The pause was only long enough for them to understand what an enormity the downward stroke would be. Then the piglet tore loose from the creepers and scurried into the undergrowth. They were left looking at each other and the place of terror. Jack's face was white under the freckles. He noticed that he still held the knife aloft and brought his arm down, replacing the blade in the sheath. Then they all three laughed, ashamedly, and began to climb back to the trap. I was choosing a place, said Jack. I was just waiting for a moment to decide where to stab him. Well, you should stick a pig, said Ralph fiercely. They always talk about sticking a pig. You cut a pig's throat to let the blood out, said Jack. Otherwise you can't eat the meat. Well, why didn't you? They knew very well why he hadn't. Because of the enormity of the knife descending and cutting into living flesh. Because of the unbearable blood. I was going to, said Jack. He was ahead of them, and they could not see his face. I was choosing a place. Next time. He snatched his knife out of the sheath and slammed it into a tree trunk. Next time, there would be no mercy. He looked round fiercely, daring them to contradict. Then they broke out into the sunlight, and for a while they were busy finding and devouring food as they moved down the scar toward the platform and the meeting. Okay, that's the end of chapter 1. Right, so we know it's an island. We have a sense of what that island looks like, right? So on one end is a big mountain. On the other end is like a big rock that's kind of stuck out in the ocean a little bit, almost like it's its own little island. And then you have all this jungle, with a big scar in the jungle where the plane crashed and then got sucked out to sea. You have that platform. Meanwhile, we're told the rock is like this pink granite. We've kind of all seen that pinkish colored rock. So, how about this though? This feels important. They find a pig caught in the weeds or caught in the vines, and Jack can't quite kill it, right? And we can understand that. The first time you would ever kill something, there's a wall there. There's like a moment of hesitation as you realize, like, whoa, I'm taking an actual life here. And so the pig ends up getting away. But he vows to not let that happen again. Okay, on to chapter 2.